The air in Harmony Creek, Wyoming, always smelled of sagebrush and cold, pristine earth. It was a town defined by vast, unforgiving landscapes and an equally vast, unforgiving sense of hierarchy. The Vances lived quietly on the edges of that hierarchy. Ellie Vance, 32 years old, was a single mother scraping by on odd jobs, yet fiercely protective of the small world she had built for her son Ethan. Ethan, 5 years old, was a whirlwind of energy. His laughter often the only sound to break the solitude of their small cottage set back from the main highway. The silence that fell at 5 o'clock on that brisk October afternoon was unlike any other. It was a silence that swallowed sound, swallowed light, and swallowed Ethan. Ellie had been sorting laundry in the back room, the familiar sound of Ethan playing with his small red wagon in the backyard serving as her mental clock. When the rhythm of his play stopped, not abruptly but gradually, merging into the background hum of the late afternoon, Ellie called his name. Ethan. Time for dinner. No answer. A second call, louder, laced with the first tendril of maternal anxiety. She stepped onto the small wooden porch. The red wagon sat neatly by the sandbox, undisturbed. The swing set swayed slightly, a ghost movement in the rising wind. The fence was intact. The backyard, which ended abruptly in a thicket of dry brush leading toward the endless open range, was empty. Ellie ran, her mind instantly rejecting the possibility. She called his name again, desperation sharpening her voice. She searched the cottage, the shed, the front yard, the surrounding brush. The sun was dipping fast, casting long, menacing shadows across the prairie. The sheer size of the landscape suddenly felt hostile, limitless. Ethan Vance had vanished without a trace. The local police arrived 30 minutes later, brought by a frantic neighbor Ellie had managed to reach. Leading the small, tight-lipped contingent was Chief Jim Riley. Riley was a man whose uniform was less an emblem of service and more a statement of authority in a town where the true authority belonged to one man, Silas Thorne. Riley did not arrive with comfort. He arrived with suspicion. He spent mere minutes scanning the large, open backyard before his eyes settled squarely on Ellie. "Mrs. Vance," Riley began, his voice dry and accusatory, ignoring her raw panic. "You left a 5-year-old boy unattended. Out here alone." "I was inside, Chief. 30 feet away. I was doing laundry." "Ethan never leaves the yard," Ellie pleaded, tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold air. Riley waved a hand, dismissing her defense instantly. "We know the narrative here, Mrs. Vance. Single mother working 3 jobs, stressed. This town knows how tight money is." His implication was clear. The simplest explanation for a disappearance often lay within the home, a dark act of desperation or negligence. The subsequent investigation over the next few hours was less a search and more a methodical probe into Ellie's life. Detectives checked her bank account, questioned her neighbors about her parenting skills, and scrutinized the small, visible signs of her poverty, the worn upholstery, the stack of unpaid bills. The focus was entirely internal. External factors, a passing vehicle, footprints by the property line, the open, unmonitored road, were deemed unlikely. Ellie, numb with shock and fighting to keep the search efforts active, recognized the conspiracy taking shape. She noticed how quickly Riley shut down the suggestion of bringing in K-9 units from the next county, claiming the snow that had begun to dust the area would compromise the scent. She noticed the subtle, almost instantaneous shift in the media narrative carried by the local Harmony Creek Gazette, a narrative that whispered of a stressed mother losing control. This narrative, Ellie knew, was dictated by the man who owned the Gazette, the man who owned the timber rights, the man who owned the debt on the Main Street businesses. Silas Thorne. Thorne rarely showed his face in public affairs, but his influence was the cold bedrock upon which Harmony Creek was built. Riley was merely his extension, a corrupt shield protecting the town's true interests. The town quickly coalesced around the established narrative. Compassion dried up, replaced by judgment. The search efforts dwindled by dawn, leaving Ellie alone in the biting cold, haunted by the vacant silence where her son's laughter should have been. She was not the victim of a crime. She was the prime suspect. Ellie stood by the edge of the barren field, watching the police lights pack up. She knew then, with a clear, terrifying certainty, that justice would not come from the official channels that had already failed her son. She was not guilty of hurting Ethan, but she was already guilty in the eyes of Harmony Creek and its powerful masters. The true fight, the fight for truth, had just begun, and she was already years behind. By the second day, the organized search effort by the Harmony Creek police officially ceased. Chief Riley held a brief, sterile press conference, citing the inclement weather and the lack of credible leads external to the home as reasons for scaling back. The implication was heavy. The answer lay within the Vance's dilapidated cottage, not the wide-open spaces of Wyoming. This decision was the first public act of betrayal by the local authority, solidifying the town's prejudice against Ellie. Ellie was left alone, consumed by a dual panic: the unbearable, crushing grief for her missing son, and the cold, terrifying realization that the police were not looking for the kidnapper. They were looking for her motive. She tried desperately to maintain the search herself, printing missing posters, walking the edges of the thicket where Ethan's scent vanished, but the town now saw her as suspect, not victim. Doors closed, eyes avoided hers, and whispers followed her like shadows. Chief Riley, under the quiet, immense pressure of the town's silent master, Silas Thorne, needed a physical link, something to tie Ellie to the assumed crime. The initial investigation provided none, so the evidence had to be manufactured. 2 days later, Detective Riley's team executed a search warrant. The atmosphere was deliberately hostile. They didn't find a body, but they found a detail that shattered Ellie's fragile remaining defense. A small, blood-stained fragment of Ethan's blue pajamas, discovered buried beneath a loose plank in the floor of the old storage shed, 20 feet from the cottage. The forensic report, though inconclusive on DNA origin due to degradation, was damning by proximity. Why would a fragment of his clothing be buried in a secluded structure used only by Ellie? The press immediately seized upon the discovery, turning the circumstantial into concrete guilt. The narrative solidified. Ellie had harmed her son and tried to dispose of the evidence near the home. The local media, controlled by Thorne's influence and advertising dollars, ran relentless stories detailing Ellie's financial distress, her exhausted state, and the volatile environment in which Ethan lived. Articles quoted unnamed sources close to the investigation, suggesting that the pressure of single motherhood and poverty had tragically led to temporary insanity. The truth was irrelevant. The convenience of the narrative was absolute. Ellie was quickly appointed a public defender, Mr. Harrison, a cynical, overworked lawyer who advised her to accept a plea deal for manslaughter due to diminished capacity. They have the town, they have the motive, and they now have the physical evidence, Ellie, Harrison warned, leaning across the battered wooden table in the police precinct. You can't win here. Silas Thorne's influence means you won't get an impartial jury, let alone an impartial judge. Ellie refused the plea. Her sanity, her love for Ethan, and her fundamental innocence were the only things she had left. I did not hurt my son. Someone took him. I will not admit to a lie. The prosecution's case was meticulously constructed around the pillars of circumstantial evidence and public sentiment. They argued that Ellie had buried the evidence, hidden the body, which they theorized was deep in the inaccessible prairie, and maintained a veneer of innocence rooted in denial. They presented the poverty as the motive and the isolation of Harmony Creek as the opportunity. The trial was a gruesome public spectacle. Ellie watched helplessly as her grief was weaponized. The judge, reliant on Thorne's support for his re-election campaign, made several procedural rulings that favored the prosecution. The jury, drawn from a community that viewed her as an unstable outsider, returned the verdict in under 4 hours. Guilty. The sentence, 10 years for manslaughter and evidence tampering, felt like a bizarre, cruel joke. Ellie's world, already decimated by loss, was now completely inverted. As the shackles were placed on her wrists, she looked past the blinding camera lights and the self-righteous faces of the jury. In the back row, silent and unmoving, she saw the subtle presence of Silas Thorne, observing the proceedings with the detached satisfaction of a man whose investments, in a corrupt police chief and a biased court system, had paid off. In that moment of final despair, a new resolve was forged. The tears stopped. The grief was channeled into a cold, unbreakable promise. Ellie Vance was going to serve her time, but she would emerge with only one goal: to find the real killer, prove her innocence, and dismantle every architect of her destruction. The system had failed her, but her revenge would be perfect in its precision and absolute in its justice. The next 10 years would be her schooling. The trial was not a search for truth. It was a societal cleansing ritual. The small courthouse in Harmony Creek, usually reserved for traffic citations and petty disputes, was packed tight, pulsating with the town's collective conviction of Ellie's guilt. Ellie's public defender, Mr. Harrison, fought with the weariness of a man who knew the verdict was sealed before the first witness took the stand. The prosecution's case was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation built on 3 flimsy pillars: circumstance, character, and the fragment. First, circumstance. They painted a detailed picture of Ellie's relentless financial struggle. Her unpaid bills were displayed as evidence of her desperation. Her exhaustion was cited as proof of her diminishing capacity to cope. They argued that the vast, isolating wilderness surrounding Harmony Creek provided the perfect place to dispose of a child's body without leaving a trace, a narrative that shielded the lack of a corpus delicti. Second, character. The prosecutor expertly leveraged the town's deeply conservative values. Ellie, the struggling single mother who had few roots and no powerful connections, was contrasted against the solid generational stability of Harmony Creek. The prosecution called neighbors who testified to her stressful temperament and her unusual quietness after the disappearance, normal reactions to trauma, twisted into evidence of cold guilt. Third, the fragment. The small, blood-stained piece of Ethan's pajamas, recovered from the shed, became the physical anchor of the prosecution's argument. Though forensic analysis could only confirm the blood belonged to a male relative, the proximity to the home was used to argue attempted concealment. The logic was simple, terrifying, and effective. Only the mother would hide the evidence so close to the home. The prosecution's star witness, subtly present throughout the proceedings, was Silas Thorne. Though he never testified directly, his influence permeated the courtroom. He sat quietly in the gallery, his tailored suit and reserved demeanor lending a silent, weighty air of moral rectitude to the side of the state. During the closing arguments, the prosecutor made a deliberate and effective appeal to the town's sense of order and safety, implying that a guilty verdict was necessary to restore the stability that men like Mr. Thorne represented. Ellie tried to testify, her voice raw with years of unspent grief and rising desperation. She spoke of Ethan's laugh, the feel of his small hand, the terror of finding the empty backyard. But her genuine, uncontrolled emotion was interpreted by the jury as hysteria. Her desperate pleas for truth dismissed as sophisticated denial. She was fighting against a well-funded, well-orchestrated narrative with nothing but her broken word. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the foreperson read the word guilty of manslaughter due to negligence leading to death, and guilty of evidence tampering, the sound of the gavel felt less like a judgment and more like the sealing of a vault door. Ellie's world, already a wasteland of loss, was officially buried. The sentencing, 10 years in a maximum security prison located hundreds of miles from Harmony Creek, was swift. As the bailiffs led her away, Ellie's eyes automatically sought out Silas Thorne in the back of the room. He met her gaze for a brief, chilling instant. There was no triumph in his eyes, only detached finality, the look of a man who had successfully managed a complex logistical problem. But standing near the door, ensuring the process was moving quickly, was Chief Jim Riley, whose face betrayed a flicker of uneasy relief. In that sterile moment, fueled by the cold certainty of her innocence and the sharp realization of their conspiracy, Ellie's grief transformed. The pain did not vanish. It hardened into a core of unyielding steel. The next 10 years would not be punishment. They would be her apprenticeship. She vowed to trade her tears for knowledge, her despair for focus. She would learn the law that had broken her, the psychology that had condemned her, and the forensic methods that had been deliberately misapplied. She made a silent promise to Riley and Thorne. They had taken 10 years of her life, but when she returned, she would take everything they valued, starting with the truth and ending with their destruction. Her innocence was not a shield. It was now the foundation of a perfectly calculated revenge. The concrete walls of the state penitentiary became the grim, stark boundaries of Ellie Vance's new world. The shock of conviction had initially left her catatonic, a period defined by the rhythmic clang of steel doors and the constant, dull roar of institutional life. She had been stripped of her freedom, her identity, and the last vestiges of her innocence. Grief, once a raging fire, cooled into a frozen, internal wasteland. But this environment designed for punishment became, ironically, her university. Ellie quickly realized that raw emotion was a liability. The system had crushed the mother. The system would now train the avenger. Her revenge demanded not tears, but knowledge, precision, and the methodical application of logic. She began her apprenticeship. Her first year was dedicated to legal studies. She haunted the prison library, devouring case law, constitutional rights, and rules of evidence. She learned the exact procedural flaws of her own trial, identifying the deliberate misapplications of circumstantial evidence and the suppression of external leads by Chief Riley. She understood the power of the paper trail, the crucial distinction between what is true and what can be proven. She discovered that Riley's success relied entirely on the legal community's collective laziness and the judge's political interests. The second and third years were devoted to forensic science and criminal psychology. She studied crime scene analysis, toxicology reports, the very disciplines Riley's team claimed to have utilized. She learned about volatile compounds, the degradation of trace evidence over time, and the psychological profiles of those who commit crimes of panic versus those who commit crimes of cold calculation. She grasped that the fragment of Ethan's pajamas was merely a planted signpost. The true evidence lay in the absence of any meaningful forensic data connecting her to the scene. Her mind became a meticulous engine, stripping away emotion to focus only on verifiable facts. The latter half of her decade was spent building a financial and digital literacy profile. She studied corporate law, offshore finance, and the methods by which influential figures like Silas Thorne shield their wealth and exert invisible control. She devoured every snippet of news about Harmony Creek she could access, Thorne's continuous expansion into land and resources, his new philanthropic ventures, and Chief Riley's sustained, unwavering position as head of the local police force. Every successful new deal by Thorne was a fresh layer of cement poured over the grave of her son and her freedom. She cultivated a new persona. Her face, once soft and expressive, hardened, gaining a reserved intensity. She learned to speak little, to observe everything, and to compartmentalize her pain. The name Ethan was never spoken. The love was internalized, transformed into a relentless, icy energy. Her 10-year sentence was not a period of stasis. It was the duration required to acquire the specialized knowledge and the patience necessary to fight men of immense power. She made careful, measured contacts. She befriended a paralegal working on appeal cases, subtly exchanging legal insights for external information channels. She created a small, untouchable reserve of cash through meticulously detailed legal work done for other inmates, resources for her re-entry and investigation. She wasn't just surviving, she was preparing. As her release date drew near, Ellie Vance was no longer the desperate, grieving mother convicted by biased sentiment. She was a self-taught legal scholar, a novice forensic analyst, and a highly motivated operative. She had traded her youth for expertise, her freedom for focus. The system had tried to bury her, but it had instead forged her into the only weapon capable of dismantling the empire built by Silas Thorne and the corrupt shield provided by Chief Riley. On the final morning, the steel door of the prison block hissed open. Ellie walked out, wearing the same quiet determination and plain clothes she had worn 10 years prior. She carried only two things: the small sum of cash and the decade-long promise of vengeance. The sun hit her face, no longer feeling like a welcome warmth, but like a harsh spotlight illuminating the path to Harmony Creek. The debt had been paid. Not hers but the debt owed to her son. And she had come to collect. Ellie's return to Harmony Creek was not a homecoming. It was an insertion. She arrived under the shield of pre-dawn darkness, avoiding the bus routes and the small, visible airport. She purchased a used, nondescript pickup truck hundreds of miles away and drove the final leg using county roads and dirt tracks, leveraging her knowledge of the remote Wyoming geography. She could not risk being recognized immediately by the police or the townspeople who had condemned her. Her first act was one of strategic withdrawal. She rented a dilapidated remote cabin 20 miles outside Harmony Creek, a place so isolated it would not register on any local surveillance radar, yet close enough to monitor her targets. She paid cash, used a falsified identity document acquired through prison connections, and established a routine designed for maximum invisibility. Her days were spent driving, observing, and preparing her minimal equipment: a basic surveillance kit, mapping software loaded onto a secure laptop, and a forensic analysis kit designed for small, trace evidence recovery. The psychological landscape of Harmony Creek had barely shifted in a decade. Silas Thorne's power had only amplified. His company, Thorne Resources, now seemed to own half the county, its massive black service trucks a constant presence on the roads. Chief Jim Riley remained firmly entrenched as the head of local law enforcement, his position secured by the quiet political funding supplied by Thorne. Their conspiracy was not just intact, it was the foundation of the town's entire infrastructure. Ellie's initial surveillance was painful. She drove past her old cottage, now occupied by strangers, the backyard where Ethan vanished feeling like a foreign country. She drove past the police precinct, noting Riley's routine. His coffee stop, his usual patrol route, the times the station was minimally staffed. She catalogued the faces of the officers who had participated in her arrest, assigning them roles in her mind: collaborator, incompetent, or neutral. Her first high-risk maneuver was to gain access to the public records library, disguising herself using simple tools, different hairstyles, non-prescription glasses, and clothing that made her look like a generic graduate student working on a rural sociology thesis. She spent weeks sifting through microfiche and digital property records, not seeking evidence of her innocence, which was already proven to herself, but seeking Thorne's blind spot. She discovered that Thorne had recently acquired a large, heavily restricted tract of land, known locally as the High Pastures, a remote area traditionally considered worthless due to its harsh terrain. Thorne had paid triple the market value for the land, citing future conservation efforts. This discrepancy, high value paid for seemingly worthless land, was the first significant anomaly in Thorne's otherwise flawless corporate facade. Ellie confirmed that the High Pastures property bordered the same wilderness where Ethan's scent was said to have been lost a decade ago. Moreover, the only access road to the property was a private, unmaintained track controlled by a single secure gate. Ellie knew that Thorne's crime had been an act of panic, meaning the child had been moved quickly to the nearest secure private location. The High Pastures property, with its sudden high-value acquisition and isolation, instantly became her primary target. It was too vast for casual surveillance, but Ellie, the investigator trained in forensic planning, knew exactly what she needed to look for: evidence of recent or significant activity in an area that should be completely fallow. The quiet observation was over. The time had come to break the silence and insert herself directly into the web of the conspiracy. She needed to expose the financial vulnerability of Chief Riley to turn him, or at least neutralize him, before she dared to trespass onto the powerful, guarded lands of Silas Thorne. Ellie's decade of legal study dictated the next target: Chief Jim Riley. Riley was the operational shield, the man who had planted the evidence and manipulated the investigation. His corruption was the linchpin holding Thorne's secret safe. Unlike Thorne, whose finances were hidden behind corporate firewalls, Riley's corruption, Ellie theorized, would be simpler, greedier, and closer to home. Ellie began a meticulous, targeted investigation into Riley's personal financial history. Using public records, tax filings, and property deeds, the paper trail ignored by the federal government but meticulously tracked by local offices, Ellie started building a clear map of Riley's life. The results were immediate and damning. Riley's salary as police chief, though respectable for Harmony Creek, did not remotely justify his lifestyle. Riley owned a new, oversized fishing boat, a cabin on the pristine side of the lake, and had recently financed a substantial renovation to his suburban home, all acquisitions made over the last decade. Furthermore, his mortgage payments were often irregular, showing large, unexplained lump sum deposits that immediately cleared outstanding debt before returning to a precarious state. The correlation was clear. Riley was financially dependent on intermittent, untraceable cash infusions. Ellie then delved into Thorne's public filings, searching for any legal or financial connection to Riley. Thorne was too smart to transfer cash directly. The money trail would be laundered through intermediaries. Ellie's breakthrough came when she cross-referenced the large, irregular deposits in Riley's bank account with the public records of a local low-profile holding company, Prairie Ventures LLC. Prairie Ventures was officially listed as a consulting firm, but its registered agent was Mr. Wallace, a man who happened to be Thorne's long-time, loyal personal accountant. Furthermore, the deposits from Prairie Ventures to Riley's account coincided almost perfectly with major land acquisitions and legal victories for Thorne Resources over the last decade. This wasn't charity. This was consistent, systemic bribery. The total amount transferred over 10 years far exceeded Riley's annual salary. It was a retirement fund built on betrayal. Ellie, working from her isolated cabin, prepared a physical file detailing the nexus of this corruption. Bank statements showing the irregular large deposits, tax documents linking those funds to Prairie Ventures LLC, and corporate filings linking Prairie Ventures directly to Thorne's accountant, Wallace. She had the chain, but she needed to use it to neutralize Riley without alerting Thorne. Her goal was not to expose Riley publicly yet. That would merely prompt Thorne to kill Riley and erase the trail. Her goal was to turn Riley into an asset, a terrified, compromised informant. Ellie needed a safe way to deliver the evidence to Riley privately. She monitored Riley's patrol patterns and found his one unmonitored weakness. Every Tuesday morning, Riley drove his personal vehicle to a remote, abandoned grain silo miles out of town to check on his hunting traps, a quiet hobby he indulged in alone, far from his police radio. This remote silo, surrounded by nothing but the vast prairie and the cold wind, would be the stage for their confrontation. Ellie prepared her final piece of evidence for Riley, a single, customized folder containing the most damning proof of the transfers, labeled with a single terrifying question. "How did you pay for the boat, Jim?" She was ready to break the silence and let the first architect of her ruin know that the past was hunting him. The time for observation was over. The time for psychological warfare had begun. The abandoned grain silo stood sentinel against the bleak Wyoming sky, a rusted, towering monument to forgotten harvests. This remote location, miles from any paved road and far outside the habitual range of local patrol cars, was the chosen stage for Ellie's first direct confrontation. It was Tuesday morning, Chief Jim Riley's scheduled time for checking his hunting traps, and the wind carried the sharp, metallic tang of cold isolation. Ellie arrived hours before dawn, meticulously sweeping the area for any signs of recent surveillance or unexpected visitors. She positioned her truck behind a ridge, ensuring it was invisible from the main track, and waited. She was dressed in layers of practical, dark clothing, her hands steady, her mind a clear expanse of cold logic. The rage that had sustained her for 10 years was now a reserve power, carefully regulated beneath her surface calm. Chief Riley arrived precisely at 8:15 a.m., driving his personal, expensive SUV, a silent testament to his corruption. He parked near the silo's base, oblivious to the fact that his private ritual was now the focus of a deeply wronged woman. Ellie allowed him 3 minutes to walk toward his first trapline. Then she stepped out from the silo's shadow, the crunch of her boot on the frozen earth echoing unervingly in the stillness. Riley stopped dead in his tracks. His hand instinctively moved toward the holster he wasn't wearing. His face, usually a mask of weary authority, registered immediate, confused fear. He recognized her instantly, despite the decade and the change in appearance. The eyes were still the same. "Ellie Vance," he stated. his voice a dry rasp of disbelief. "You're out. What in God's name are you doing here?" "I'm checking on my investments, Chief," Ellie replied, her voice low and even, utterly devoid of the hysteria he remembered. She slowly pulled out the customized, labeled folder. "How did you pay for the boat, Jim?" And placed it on the hood of his SUV. Riley's gaze darted from the folder to Ellie, then frantically scanned the horizon. His fear wasn't about the woman. It was about the potential witnesses. "Don't be ridiculous," he tried, forcing a dismissive laugh that died instantly in the cold air. "I earned every cent I own. You have no right." "I have the right to the truth, Jim," Ellie interrupted, her eyes boring into his. "And you have a luxury fishing boat, a remodeled cabin, and mortgage payments funded by Prairie Ventures LLC. A company whose registered agent is Wallace, Silas Thorne's personal accountant. The deposits coincide with every major legal victory Thorne Resources has had in this county over the last 10 years. I have bank statements, tax records, and corporate filings. Everything. Do you know what the FBI calls this, Jim? They call it systemic bribery. They call it federal prison." The color drained from Riley's face. The sheer, overwhelming detail of the evidence he believed was safely buried in local chaotic archives, paralyzed him. He no longer saw Ellie Vance, the unstable single mother. He saw a prosecutor armed with lethal data. Thorne handles the payments." "He said it was a consultancy fee," Riley stammered, his defense instantly dissolving into a plea. "He said it was clean. He said no one would ever look that close." "Thorne was right about everyone except me, Jim," Ellie said, taking a calculated step closer. "You framed me. You planted the evidence and covered for the man who murdered my son. And now you are going to pay. But not in prison. Not yet." Ellie presented her terms, dictating the new reality with cold authority. "You have two choices. Choice 1, I walk out of here. I send this file anonymously to the state police, the district attorney, and the IRS. You lose your badge, your boat, your cabin, and you spend the next 2 decades answering for corruption and evidence tampering. Choice 2. You keep your uniform, you keep your boat, and you keep silent about seeing me. But you become my asset. My eyes and ears inside the precinct." Riley's breath hitched, the moral choice non-existent in the face of his material ruin. "What do you want?" "I want the truth, and I want the man who owns you," Ellie said. "Your first task is simple. You will plant this." She pulled a tiny high-frequency surveillance microphone, no bigger than a thumbnail, out of her coat pocket. "You will plant this in the chief's secure phone line at the precinct. Tonight. I need to know every call, every warning, every interaction you and your department have with Silas Thorne." Riley hesitated, clutching the metal microphone as if it were burning his hand. "He'll know, Ellie. Thorne is careful. If he finds out I'm compromised, he won't hesitate to kill me. He built this town. He controls everything." "Then you understand the stakes," Ellie agreed, her expression unmoved. "The alternative is prison and total loss. Thorne trusts you because you are his corrupt asset. I trust you because I own your corruption. You will choose the shadow that offers you the best chance of survival. Now tell me, Jim, where did you bury the real investigation files? The ones Thorne made you dismiss?" Riley, defeated, lowered his head. He knew that even if he killed Ellie now, the file was already moving. He was trapped between two titans, the cold institutional power of Thorne and the precise personal terror embodied by Ellie. "The old server," Riley whispered, gesturing vaguely toward Harmony Creek. "Thorne made us wipe the digital copies and transfer the physical reports, the credible ones, to an off-site county storage unit years ago. Case files, Vance E. Box 14. They're still there. I swear that's all I know. I never saw the boy. I just buried the paper." Ellie accepted the information without reaction. It was the first solid lead into the physical evidence that could connect Thorne to the crime. She gave Riley a cold, final look. "You will plant the device tonight, Jim. If I hear even one word of caution or warning reaching Silas Thorne, the state police will have this file by dawn. Your clock starts now." She turned and walked back to her hidden truck, leaving Chief Jim Riley alone by the silo, a compromised puppet caught between the vast, silent power of the wealthy and the surgical precision of the woman who had returned from the dead. The microphone was planted. Ellie received a discreet, prearranged signal, a specific coded interruption on a public radio frequency, confirming that Chief Riley, compromised and terrified, had successfully installed the surveillance device on his police line. Ellie was now positioned outside Harmony Creek's system, listening in as the conspirators continued their work, unaware their operational shield had been compromised. The initial audio stream was mundane. Routine police business, local complaints, and Riley's strained, almost paranoid conversations with his wife about their financial stresses. But beneath the routine, the constant low-frequency presence of Silas Thorne was evident. Riley was Thorne's puppet, confirming meetings, providing status updates on minor local political matters, and, crucially, never mentioning the Vance case. The secrecy was a weapon, confirming that the files Riley had buried were lethal. Ellie's next objective was the county's off-site storage unit, a sprawling complex several miles from Harmony Creek where archived records were housed. Riley had indicated the exact location. Case files, Vance E. Box 14. This was where the official investigation, the one never seen by the jury, lay dormant. Infiltrating the county archives required a shift in strategy. Unlike a mansion, the archives relied on institutional low-tech security, motion sensors, heavy locks, and perimeter fencing. Ellie spent 3 days observing the facility, meticulously mapping the patrol schedule of the single night guard and the camera blind spots. Her goal was not to steal the entire box, but to access it, retrieve the critical evidence, and replace the contents without leaving a trace. A forensic impossible scenario for the local police. On a moonless Thursday night, Ellie executed the infiltration. She bypassed the perimeter fence with wire cutters and navigated the vast complex of metal storage units. She wore specialized gear, dark clothing coated in a thin layer of particulate dust she had collected locally, ensuring any trace evidence left behind would match the environment. She neutralized the external motion sensors with a simple electromagnetic dampener, a skill she had honed during her years of relentless study. Locating the specific unit was easy. The lock, a standard commercial grade, was quickly neutralized using a precise lockpicking technique. Ellie slipped inside the cold, airless storage unit, the heavy scent of aged paper and dry mold overwhelming her senses. Finding Box 14 was the most emotionally taxing part of the mission. The box was sealed, labeled clearly with Vance E. Using a non-invasive steaming process, Ellie carefully broke the seal and opened the box. The contents were a raw, unfiltered journey back into her worst nightmare. Crime scene photographs, early untainted witness interviews, and personal effects of Ethan that had never been returned. A faded, small toy truck, a crayon drawing. Tears, the first genuine ones in years, burned her eyes, quickly suppressed. She forced herself to focus, her hands trembling slightly as she sifted through the official documents. She was not here for grief. She was here for justice. Her search focused on evidence that pointed away from the cottage and toward Thorne. She found 2 crucial pieces of suppressed evidence. A witness statement, an early raw interview with an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who was dismissed by Riley. Mrs. Henderson reported seeing a large, black industrial vehicle, not the typical pickup, driving slowly near the Vance property around 5 p.m. on the day Ethan disappeared. She specifically recalled the company logo, a stylized T within a circular crest, matching the obscure logo of Thorne Resources Maintenance Division. Forensic photographs. A set of photographs taken during the initial, short-lived search outside the Vance's property line. One specific photo, taken on the soft, muddy shoulder of the dirt road, showed a clear, distinct tire track. The tread pattern was unusually wide and deep, consistent with heavy industrial machinery, not local traffic. Riley's team had dismissed it as a farm vehicle. Ellie, with her forensic knowledge, instantly recognized the industrial pattern, identical to the treads used on Thorn Resources' specialized drilling equipment. The evidence was overwhelming. Riley had manufactured guilt using the pajama fragment while suppressing undeniable physical proof linking the disappearance to Thorn Resources. The tire track and the witness testimony confirmed that Ethan had been taken by a vehicle directly connected to Silas Thorn. Ellie carefully photographed every relevant page, log, and photo, transferring the data securely to her encrypted laptop. She then meticulously resealed Box 14, restoring the lock and the institutional seal with forensic precision, ensuring the archive remained an undisturbed ghost of its past. She left the storage unit just before the night guard's scheduled patrol, melting back into the empty plains. She had the truth. The conspiracy was proven, and the next steps were clear. Find out why Thorn killed Ethan, and where the body was located. A terrible journey that led directly to Thorn's heavily guarded, isolated property, the high pastures. Absolutamente. A buscapella verdade se agora dos arquivos frios e vai para o território hos til do inimigo, mantendo o rigor de contingem de caracteres. Acquiesta o capítulo 9, onde Ellie se infiltra na propriedade secreta de Silas Thorn, com mais de 5.000 characters, pronto para anarqueo Ingles. Open Book The Price of Shadow. Chapter 9, The Hidden Property. The evidence retrieved from the county archives, the witness statement, the forensic photographs of the industrial tire tracks, was the physical proof Ellie needed. The link between Thorn Resources and Ethan's disappearance was no longer theory. It was fact, suppressed by Chief Riley's systemic corruption. The next logical step was the highly restricted, overvalued property, the high pastures. Ellie dedicated the next 2 weeks to preparation. This was not an administrative infiltration. This was entry into a potentially hostile environment controlled by a man who commanded significant private security. She upgraded her gear, acquiring high-quality thermal imaging binoculars, cold-weather climbing equipment, and specialized footwear designed to leave minimal, ambiguous tracks on the varied terrain. She packed only essentials: water, high-energy rations, and a compact shovel and digging tools, a necessary preparation for the heartbreaking truth she expected to unearth. The journey to the high pastures was arduous. The property was massive, bordered by sheer rock faces and dense, rarely traversed forest, exactly the type of terrain Thorn Resources claimed was worthless. Ellie approached the property entirely off-road, navigating by satellite imagery and memory of the local geography. She avoided the single, heavily fortified gate, choosing instead a rugged ridge that offered a natural blind spot for entry. The initial surveillance confirmed her suspicions about Thorn's deception. While there were no signs of mining or logging activity, the ostensible reasons for the purchase, the area was ringed by a sophisticated, albeit subtly disguised, perimeter fence and occasional private security patrols, indicating a far higher degree of value and secrecy than its declared conservation status suggested. Under the cloak of a cold, moonless night, Ellie bypassed the perimeter sensors by exploiting the natural shadows of the ridge. She entered the high pastures property, moving slowly, using the thermal optics to scan for heat signatures and tripwires. The air here was thinner, the silence absolute. Ellie spent hours traversing the land, searching not for construction, but for disruption. She finally found the anomaly near the geographical center of the massive tract. A relatively small, level area of ground, clearly recently cleared and then meticulously restored. The surrounding vegetation was patchy, struggling to regrow, and the soil texture was different, looser, disturbed, inconsistent with the hard, natural earth of the prairie. This patch, perhaps 30 feet by 30 feet, was clearly the site of significant clandestine work. As she knelt down, running her gloved fingers over the freezing, yielding soil, Ellie detected a faint, acrid scent, a subtle chemical odor masked by the cold earth and pine needles. Using her specialized forensic kit, she collected soil samples from the disturbed area and compared them to the surrounding natural earth. The difference was undeniable. The disturbed soil contained trace levels of industrial residue, specifically synthetic polymer compounds, materials used in chemical packaging or heavy-duty tarps, completely unrelated to natural conservation. More chillingly, embedded deep within the topsoil, Ellie found a tiny, almost microscopic piece of plastic, bright red, brittle and oddly shaped. She carefully bagged the fragment. It wasn't until she reached a safer distance to examine it under magnification that the full, terrible realization hit her. The fragment was a piece of the red plastic clasp from the safety strap of Ethan's small red wagon, the toy he had been playing with the day he disappeared. The proof was visceral, raw, and absolutely irrefutable. Silas Thorne had murdered her son, not out of malice, but out of the sheer necessity to cover his own illegal operations that Ethan had inadvertently witnessed. He had transported Ethan's body to this isolated high-value property using a Thorne Resources truck, and then meticulously covered the evidence, purchasing the entire tract of land as the ultimate protective measure, a financial shield over a crime scene. The despair was paralyzing, a physical pain that threatened to crush her chest. She had found the truth, but the truth meant confirming the death of her son and the depth of Thorne's calculated evil. She lay prone on the freezing ground, the red fragment clutched tightly in her hand. The decade of cold planning, the legal studies, the emotional hardening, all of it threatened to dissolve into pure, overwhelming grief. But she pushed the pain down, deeper than the soil she had just disturbed. The tears did not come. Instead, the memory of her son's laugh hardened into an absolute focus. The final phase was no longer about proving her innocence. It was about delivering the vengeance that her son, her decade of unjust imprisonment, and her betrayed sense of justice demanded. She had the why, she had the where, and she had the proof. Now she needed the final fatal trap. Absolutamente. A descoberta do fragmento do Corinho Sila o destino de Thorne. A partir de agora, o foco é a execução fria e calculada de vingança, utilizando o próprio crime de Thorne contra ele seu delegado corrupto. Acquiesta o capítulo 10, onde ele desvenda o motivo final e arma a emboscada, com mais de 5.000 characters, pronto para anarqueo em inglês. Open Book The Price of Shadow. Chapter 10, The Core of the Conspiracy. The confirmation was agonizing. The small, bright piece of red plastic in Ellie's hand was the final, devastating answer. She allowed the grief only one night, a period of cold, silent resolve in the isolation of her cabin, where she finally mourned the end of hope. By dawn, the pain was transformed into a surgical intent. The goal was no longer merely to expose. It was to eliminate the rot entirely. Ellie's immediate task was to understand the true purpose of the high pastures. Why would Silas Thorne commit murder and pay triple market value for a massive, remote property simply to bury a child? The answer lay in the chemical residue she had collected. Using a secure, anonymous connection established through international proxies, Ellie analyzed the soil samples and the unique industrial tire treads. The forensic report was damning. The disturbed soil contained high concentrations of heavy metal sludge and specific industrial solvents, byproducts of Thorne Resources mining operations that were highly toxic and globally prohibited from land disposal. Thorne hadn't bought the land for conservation. He bought it as a massive, illegal dumping ground for hazardous waste, saving billions in regulatory compliance and disposal fees. Ethan's disappearance now made horrifying sense. At 5 years old, playing near the thicket, he must have stumbled upon one of Thorne's black service trucks illegally dumping the first loads of waste, witnessing the secret that could dismantle Thorne's entire public facade and expose him to international environmental prosecution. The murder was not malice. It was calculated asset protection. This discovery provided Ellie with the perfect weapon. The crime was ongoing, and the illegal dumping site, hidden and volatile, was the ideal stage for her final act. She had to lure both architects of her ruin, Silas Thorne to protect his fortune, and Chief Jim Riley to manage the imminent cleanup, to the site simultaneously. Ellie initiated the final phase of surveillance. She monitored Riley's compromised police phone line, Chapter 7, and analyzed Thorne's known communication patterns, noting his reliance on secure, but predictable proprietary communication channels with his chief legal counsel. Her plan required precision and leverage. She needed to make Thorne believe that the illegal dumping site, his most valuable secret, had been discovered by an external federal agent who was already heading to the site to collect samples. This would trigger an immediate, panicked response from both Thorne to secure the evidence and Riley to establish a police cordon. Ellie crafted a sophisticated digital message. She used her technical skills to spoof the IP address and email header of a high-ranking federal environmental protection agent known to operate in the region. The message, brief and urgent, was sent directly to Thorne's secure counsel. The message read, "Compliance Order 24B. Field Team en route to high pastures. Immediate sample collection. Environmental violation imminent." The effect was instantaneous and electrifying. Riley's phone line immediately lit up with frantic, coded calls from Thorne's legal team. Riley, terrified, was dispatched to the high pastures property under the guise of investigating local vandalism, but his true mission was clear: secure the gate and delay the supposed federal agents. The trap was set. Ellie left her hidden cabin for the final time. She was armed with her forensic kit, specialized tools, and a deep, intimate knowledge of the terrain of the high pastures property, knowledge that would be her greatest advantage. Her plan for the confrontation was brutal and final, using the volatile industrial compounds themselves. She would ensure that the secluded refuge where Thorne met his most trusted allies, a small prefabricated structure near the main dumping pit, would become the place where the illegal waste would claim its final victims. She drove toward the high pastures, the small red wagon fragment secure in her pocket. The decade of planning had culminated in this night. There would be no trial, no appeals, and no biased juries. Only the swift, cold justice of the Wyoming wilderness. Ellie reached the high pastures property under the cloak of deep night, arriving hours before Chief Riley's anticipated arrival. Her pickup truck was hidden miles away, and the final stretch was covered on foot, using the rugged terrain and dense brush as cover. This vast, empty tract of land, contaminated by Silas Thorne's toxic industrial waste, was now her theater of operations. The focal point of her plan was the main illegal dumping pit, a deep, excavated trench where the heavy metal sludge had been recently buried and covered. Near the pit stood Thorne's prefabricated refuge structure, a small, insulated shed used for secret meetings, positioned conveniently close to the central crime scene. This pit and the shed would be the stage for the final act of her decade-long vengeance. Ellie's preparations were meticulous, drawing heavily on her forensic and engineering studies. She first established a perimeter, rigging thin, nearly invisible monofilament lines across the main access routes around the pit, not to trip but to serve as silent alarms. She then focused on the pit itself, using her compact digging tools to uncover a section of the freshly buried toxic sludge, exposing a small, volatile area. The chemical fumes, though faint, were acrid and potent. This exposure was necessary to create a palpable, immediate threat upon the target's arrival. Her primary task regarding Chief Jim Riley was neutralization without lethal force, at least initially. Riley was a tool. He needed to be leveraged, not eliminated prematurely. Ellie identified a deep, narrow ravine near the main access road, naturally concealed by snow-covered debris, which offered the perfect location for an ambush. Ellie had calculated that Riley would arrive paranoid and alone, his mind preoccupied with the imagined federal agents. He would exit his vehicle quickly, scanning the horizon, focusing on the external threat rather than the immediate ground around him. The temperature was biting, but Ellie's concentration was absolute. She heard the distant low rumble of Riley's heavy-duty SUV approaching well before dawn. She positioned herself high above the ravine, the wind muffling her movements. Riley arrived, his SUV stopping abruptly near the fortified gate. He stepped out, his face etched with strain, his hand hovering over the pistol secured to his belt. He was dressed in plain clothes, attempting to maintain anonymity, but his posture screamed authority and fear. He searched the perimeter, his eyes desperately seeking a government sedan or a familiar face. He found neither. He moved toward the gate, looking for signs of forced entry. That was when Ellie moved. She didn't use force. She used sound. Using a small, high-powered directional speaker she had concealed in the brush, Ellie projected a single, synthesized audio clip across the clearing, the distinct sound of a police radio dispatch calling out Riley's license plate number for a routine vehicle check near the High Pastures property. Riley froze. The sound of his own department tracking him instantly eclipsed his fear of Thorne. He panicked, diving toward the cover of his SUV, fumbling for his keys. In that brief moment of distraction, Ellie descended the ravine, moving swiftly and silently. She reached the SUV before Riley could lock the door. With practiced precision, she used a chemical spray, a non-lethal high-concentration sedative acquired through black market channels, on a cloth and pressed it firmly over his mouth and nose before he could react. Riley struggled violently for a few seconds, his muffled cries lost to the wind, but the sedative was fast-acting. His body went limp, collapsing back into the driver's seat. Ellie worked quickly. She secured Riley with heavy-duty zip ties, searched his vehicle for any hidden communication devices, finding and disabling a small tracking beacon, and pulled him into the concealed ravine. She injected him with a measured dose of an antidote and stimulant, enough to keep him conscious, terrified, and highly suggestible, but incapable of resisting. When Riley's eyes fluttered open, he found himself bound, gagged, and staring up at the cold, determined face of Ellie Vance. "Hello, Jim," Ellie whispered, kneeling beside him, the vast, isolated landscape her witness. "I see you remembered my name." Riley thrashed weakly, his eyes wide with a horror far exceeding his earlier fear of federal agents. "You're going to tell me exactly how you coordinated the initial search with Silas Thorne, why you planted the evidence, and the exact timetable of Thorne's arrival here," Ellie demanded, her voice flat. "But first, you're going to help me set the final stage for your employer. You are my insurance, Jim. And if Thorne arrives before we are ready, he will see you as a liability and eliminate you. Your life now depends on my plan." She revealed the exposed, toxic pit, its location dangerously close to Riley's position. The threat was clear: cooperate fully or become part of Thorne's final toxic mistake. Riley, trapped and facing imminent death either by his boss or the environment, nodded weakly. His 10 years of corrupt service had finally caught up to him. Chief Jim Riley was no longer the confident architect of injustice. He was a desperate, compromised tool. Bound and shivering in the ravine, he became an unwilling source of intelligence, his decades of complicity now serving the woman he had sent to prison. Ellie kept the chemical sedative minimal, ensuring Riley remained lucid enough to understand the full weight of his predicament, cooperate or be consumed by the same corruption he served. Ellie's immediate need was precise data regarding Silas Thorne's protocol. She pressed Riley for details on his superior's movements and mindset. "When will he arrive, Jim? Tell me the truth, or the state police will be reviewing those bank statements by noon." Ellie's voice was a chilling monotone, leveraging his fear of prison against his fear of Thorne. Riley, defeated, confessed that Thorne, after receiving the panic message about the federal agents, would bypass his usual security team. "He thinks they'll contaminate the evidence. He'll come alone, maybe with his personal security manager, but he'll try to enter the property by himself first. He should arrive within the hour. He's meticulous about timing. He won't delay when his fortune is at stake." Ellie now had the timing. The next crucial step was neutralizing Thorne's suspicion. She needed to lure him into a false sense of security. She directed Riley to call Thorne's secured number using his concealed police burner phone. Tell him the federal alert was a false alarm, a mistake by a junior officer who misidentified a local EPA truck. Tell him the perimeter is secure, but the site needs immediate cleanup and stabilization. Stress the volatility of the material. That will ensure he comes alone and focuses immediately on the pit. Riley, his voice cracking with terror, executed the call perfectly. The familiar cadence of his police voice lent credibility to the lie, easing Thorne's immediate panic and shifting his focus from surveillance to damage control. The betrayal was complete. Riley, the loyal shield, had now become the decisive instrument in Thorne's downfall. The stage for the final act was set. Ellie had confirmed that the small, prefabricated refuge structure near the main pit was Thorne's primary focus. This shed, designed for isolation and private meetings, offered the perfect setting for the fatal accident. Ellie began rigging the immediate vicinity of the pit. Her knowledge of high-risk compounds, acquired through years of prison study, was crucial. She utilized several small, highly concentrated chemical agents, purchased during her preparation phase, designed to accelerate the natural volatility of the industrial solvents already buried in the pit. The goal was to engineer a rapid, violent chemical reaction and structural collapse that would appear entirely consistent with the inherent danger of illegal toxic dumping, triggered by a structural flaw or negligence. The crucial technical detail involved the refuge structure. The shed was built slightly too close to the edge of the illegal pit, a greedy architectural oversight by Thorne to maximize his privacy. Ellie used high-tensile wire and a winch system from her truck, anchored deep in the surrounding earth, to destabilize the pit's edge subtly. This rigging, combined with the chemical accelerant, would ensure that when the reaction occurred, the very ground beneath the refuge structure would give way, swallowing it and its occupants into the toxic pit. The physical setup was taxing, requiring all of Ellie's strength and engineering precision. The work was interrupted only by the desperate, pleading whispers of Riley, who begged her to consider his family. "Please, Ellie, I have a family. I never saw your boy. I only buried the paperwork. Let me go, and I swear I will testify against him. I'll give you the real evidence." "You had 10 years to testify, Jim," Ellie replied, her voice empty of pity as she tightened a final wire anchor. 10 years while I was in prison and my son was buried in that dirt. Your testimony is worthless now. Your silence made you guilty. Your death will make this crime perfect." She positioned Riley, still bound, inside a heavy-duty storage container several hundred yards away, ensuring he was safe from the immediate chemical impact but close enough to witness the event. Riley would serve as the terrified, non-complicit witness for the inevitable investigation, his account framing the incident as a catastrophic environmental accident triggered by Thorne's own reckless haste. The final piece of the trap was psychological. Ellie took Riley's official police radio, cleaned the device meticulously, and placed it inside the refuge structure, along with a newly purchased disposable phone. This would ensure that the last communications traced back to the scene would involve Thorne's panic and Riley's apparent presence before the accident. The low, distant sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the cold air. Thorne. He was early. Ellie vanished into the deep cover of the woods, melting into the vast landscape she had mastered. The trap was sprung. The heavy, specialized SUV belonging to Silas Thorne finally appeared through the dense pine trees, its powerful engine a low growl that shattered the pristine silence of the high pastures. Thorne stopped the vehicle abruptly near the fortified gate, but did not wait. He emerged quickly, alone, his face a hard mask of controlled fury, focused entirely on the breach of his security and the potential ruin of his fortune. He wore expensive outdoor gear, but his posture, rigid, commanding, remained that of a boardroom predator. He didn't notice the subtle tension in the air, the faint, acrid smell that Ellie had allowed to escape from the pit, or the nearly invisible tautness of the rigging wire secured deep within the freezing earth. His attention was solely on the illegal dumping site, the pit itself, his vulnerability, his secret. He moved straight toward the refuge structure, pulling a secured sat phone from his pocket, likely preparing to coordinate an immediate cleanup operation. Ellie allowed him to enter the small, insulated shed. She let the heavy sound of the door closing echo, sealing him within the designated kill zone. She did not need to be physically close. Her vengeance was a matter of calculated distance and leveraged engineering. Then, Ellie stepped out from the concealment of the woods. She walked slowly toward the refuge structure, positioning herself directly beside the exposed edge of the pit, the volatile fault line she had created. The wind whipped her hair, but her movements were steady and deliberate. Using a highly focused directional speaker, a crucial piece of equipment she had carried, Ellie projected her voice directly into the soundproof shed. "Welcome to the high pastures, Mr. Thorne. I hope you find the air quality suitable for your important meeting." The sound, unexpected and disembodied, instantly halted Thorne's movements inside the shed. His initial reaction was confused vigilance, believing it to be a federal operative. He opened the door, his hand reaching inside for a weapon he had concealed, scanning the surrounding trees. When his eyes finally landed on Ellie, standing alone near the lethal pit, the confusion morphed into cold, absolute shock. He recognized her instantly, despite the decade and the transformation. The intensity of her gaze was unforgettable. "Vance," he whispered, the name a harsh exhalation of disbelief. "How are you here? You should be in prison." "I paid my debt," Ellie replied, her voice projected clearly, cold as the Wyoming winter. "You and Jim Riley made sure of that. But I found my refund. It was here, in your accounting records and your toxic soil." Thorne immediately regained his composure, shifting from shock to predator. "This is insane. You're trespassing, Mrs. Vance. Get off my property now, or I will call the sheriff." "Call him Silas," Ellie invited, a grim smile touching her lips. "He's nearby. He helped me set the stage." Thorne's face flickered with genuine alarm. The thought of Riley being compromised was a greater threat than a single, desperate woman. "What did you do to Riley? What are you trying to achieve?" "I'm achieving justice for Ethan," Ellie stated, her voice rising, the emotional core finally exposed, raw and undeniable. She pulled the small red plastic fragment, the clasp from Ethan's wagon, from her pocket and held it up, letting the weak light catch its color. "Do you remember this, Silas? It's from the toy my son was playing with when your truck drove by. You didn't kill him because you hated him. You killed him because he saw your first illegal dumping run here at the high pastures. He saw your secret." Thorne's denial was immediate, violent, and predictable. "You are delusional. This is defamation. I bought this land for conservation. You bought it to bury your industrial waste, Silas. The soil around this structure is saturated with highly toxic solvents. You paid triple the market value to hide a crime scene and a violation that would cost you your empire. That, Silas, is the motive I needed." She paused, allowing the sheer weight of the truth, and the raw evidence she clearly possessed, to crush his arrogance. Thorne's posture changed. He was cornered, realizing she had solved his perfect crime. "You should have let me go to prison and forgotten me," Ellie continued, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge. "But you kept the secret alive. You kept my son's final resting place here, under your fortress of lies. That arrogance is your fatal flaw." She looked at the ground beneath the refuge structure, now noticeably uneven due to her meticulous rigging. "You created the crime, Silas. Now you will suffer the consequence of your own flawed engineering." Ellie reached inside her coat and retrieved a small, remote-controlled detonator, a device designed to initiate a precise chemical fuse. "I won't call the police, Silas. I won't let the system that failed me judge you. The high pastures will judge you." Thorne lunged forward, his eyes wide with animal terror, realizing the threat was not legal, but physical and immediate. "No, we can negotiate. I'll give you everything. The company, the money. The debt is already paid," Ellie said, her finger finding the small activation button. "This land is too toxic to ever be clean. It deserves to be permanently sealed." She pressed the button. A low, grinding rumble erupted from the ground near the pit, followed by a sharp cracking sound, the final tension snapping the hidden rigging wires. The unstable ground beneath the refuge structure began to shift violently, collapsing inward toward the newly exposed, chemically volatile pit. Thorne screamed, his powerful voice reduced to a primal sound of despair as the floor of the shed buckled. The toxic sludge, now destabilized and exposed to the atmosphere, began to react violently, releasing thick, noxious fumes. The fortress had become a death trap, built by his own greed and triggered by the woman he had underestimated. The sound of the collapse was a deep, sickening crunch of metal twisting against shifting earth, followed by a violent, muffled roar as the toxic sludge, agitated by the structural failure, reacted to the introduced catalyst. A thick, yellowish plume of noxious chemical smoke immediately erupted from the yawning fissure where the refuge structure had stood seconds before. The specialized shed, Silas Thorne's final sanctuary, vanished into the volatile pit, sealed by the earth and the lethal consequences of his own greed. Ellie did not watch the final moment of Thorne's desperate struggle. She turned away the moment the floor buckled, protecting herself from the worst of the toxic fumes, relying on the speed of the chemical reaction and the structural design flaw she had exploited. The vengeance was complete, immediate, and tragically framed by the inherent danger of the site itself. Her immediate task shifted from execution to evidence management. She moved swiftly to the ravine where Chief Jim Riley was secured, conscious but incapacitated by fear and the lingering effects of the sedative. Riley had witnessed the entire terrifying sequence, the sudden, calculated appearance of Ellie Vance, the accusation of murder, and the subsequent violent destruction of his benefactor, engineered by the woman he had sent to prison. He was found now convulsing weakly against his restraints, his eyes wide and vacant, fixed on the smoke column rising from the pit. Ellie knelt beside him, removing the gag. "Talk to me, Jim. What did you see?" Riley stammered, his words choked by terror. An accident. The ground gave way. The toxins. He didn't secure the site. He tried to cover it with the shed, but the pit collapsed. It was the waste, Ellie. The damned waste. His account was exactly what Ellie needed, the natural conclusion drawn from the scene. Riley's fear of Thorne had been instantly replaced by the absolute, paralyzing fear of the toxic, volatile truth of the high pastures. He would testify not to murder, but to catastrophic industrial negligence. Ellie injected him with a measured dose of stimulant, enough to counteract the lingering sedative and ensure his coherence, but not enough to allow him to resist his constraints immediately. She left him the police radio she had previously secured, placing it just within reach, forcing him into the inevitable next step. "The federal agencies will be here soon, Jim. They received my initial anonymous tip. They will find the illegal dumping. They will find the remains of Thorne and his secrets." Ellie's voice was firm, delivering the final operational command. "You will tell them that Thorne came here alone, panicked, and that the ground collapsed due to the unstable chemicals. You were investigating the vandalism he reported, and you were too late. You will keep your life, Jim. But you will bury this crime one last time, under the official conclusion of environmental disaster." She replaced the gag, ensuring his silence until she was miles away. Ellie then undertook the painstaking process of erasing herself from the scene. She methodically recovered every piece of specialized rigging, the anchor wires, the mechanical winch, breaking them down into small, dispersible components and burying them deep beneath the snow and rock, far from the toxic pit. She neutralized the chemical scent left by her gear and performed a final sweep of the terrain, using her forensic knowledge to ensure her tracks were ambiguous and untraceable. She destroyed the satellite phone she had used to send the fake federal alert, grinding the SIM card into dust. Her final act was retrieving the small red wagon fragment. The evidence of Ethan's death, no longer needed to prove the crime, was now a piece of her own closure. She hiked back to her hidden truck, the silence of the wilderness no longer feeling hostile, but vast and neutral. She had sought justice not in the flawed, biased legal system that had imprisoned her, but in the impartial, immutable laws of chemistry and physics, leveraging Thorne's own criminality to ensure his total destruction. Ellie drove away from the high pastures, watching the column of smoke dissipate against the Wyoming sky. Thorne was gone. Riley was compromised. Her innocence was proven, if only to herself and the cold earth. The decade of planning, the acquisition of specialized knowledge, the suppression of grief, it had all culminated in this clean, total outcome. She had paid her debt to the past, and now the future was finally her own. The official report, released 3 days later, was a meticulous construction of convenience and half-truths, exactly as Ellie had planned. Chief Jim Riley, shaken but alive, was hailed by the local media as a hero who had stumbled upon a massive, catastrophic environmental disaster. His testimony, that he was investigating local vandalism and arrived just as the unstable, illegally buried chemicals caused a rapid structural collapse, killing Silas Thorne, was supported by the volatility of the site and the overwhelming evidence of Thorne Resources' criminal activities. The investigation quickly ballooned into a multi-state federal inquiry focused entirely on corporate malfeasance, illegal dumping, and environmental homicide charges against the deceased Silas Thorne. The forensic teams, overwhelmed by the sheer toxicity of the site, focused on identifying the dangerous chemicals and calculating the cost of the cleanup, not on trace evidence of a secondary perpetrator. The focus shifted entirely from the mystery of Ethan Vance's disappearance to the magnitude of Thorne's environmental crimes. The tragedy of Thorne's death was framed as the ultimate, self-inflicted consequence of his own ruthless ambition. Ellie watched the developments unfold from a remote, untraceable location far from Wyoming. She had meticulously dismantled her life in Harmony Creek. The cabin was vacated, the anonymous truck sold for cash hundreds of miles away, and her encrypted digital footprint erased with the precision of a professional cleaner. The promise she had made a decade ago, to expose the truth and dismantle the architects of her suffering, was fulfilled. Her final act was one of closure, not confrontation. She secured the funds she had meticulously saved and earned during her imprisonment, now supplemented by the final liquidation of her meager assets. She knew she could never return to her old identity. Ellie Vance was legally a pariah, though morally vindicated. She needed a new beginning, untainted by the shadows of Harmony Creek. The ultimate measure of her success lay in the details. The original case files of Ethan Vance's disappearance, the true, untainted reports, were now part of the federal evidence against Silas Thorne. The tire track photographs, the neighbor's testimony, and the evidence of the illegal dumping were now permanently enshrined in the official record, silently clearing her name and confirming the innocence she had carried for 10 years. She knew Riley would live with the terror of her knowledge for the rest of his life. His continued compliance secured not by threat, but by the paralyzing fear that his own corruption was documented and ready to be exposed should he ever stray from the truth. His survival was contingent on honoring the final verdict of the wilderness. Ellie performed one final, deeply personal service. Using her resources, she anonymously arranged for a substantial donation to be made to a national foundation dedicated to helping families with missing children. The foundation years ago had briefly offered comfort before the system turned against her. This donation, made in the name of a friend of Ethan, was her private acknowledgement of the future they could not share. The quiet, relentless rage that had sustained her for a decade finally subsided, replaced by a profound, if melancholic, peace. She was no longer driven by the need for revenge, but by the simple, enduring memory of her son's light. She retrieved the small red wagon fragment, the final piece of physical proof, and buried it gently in a remote, peaceful location, a private memorial to the life that was unjustly taken. Ellie Vance ceased to exist. In her place emerged a new woman, fully prepared, financially secure, and legally invisible, ready to build a life based on the hard-won principles of truth and engineering excellence she had learned in the harshest of schools. She didn't seek public acquittal, she sought quiet freedom. She had paid the debt of the past, and she had ensured that the conspirators paid the price of the shadow. Her final service was complete, and she disappeared into the vast, open anonymity of the American landscape, truly free at last. Com certeza. Acquiesto pacote de marketing completo, traducido para o Ingles. Clapperboard final marketing package. English. Closing and call to action, CTA. Closing/call to action. Ellie Vance paid her debt with time and ensured that Silas Thorne and Chief Riley paid with their lives and reputation. Her revenge was not an act of rage, but the final execution of a 10-year promise. She proved that the law fails, but justice, when done with precision, is absolute. What about you? Would you have been able to wait for 10 years, or would you have exposed the truth as soon as you left prison? Leave your revenge strategy in the comments. If you admire the patience and precision of this mother, Hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of instant and planned justice.